Hello, this is Craig. I'd like to talk about beat-em-up enemies and what makes beat-em-up enemies unique out of, I think, any enemies anywhere um, in any kind of game. First thing is, I've introduced a new kind of enemy called the Ro-Man, and he's that big guy. These small fast goblins are still here, but they team up with the larger, slower Ro-Man. The Ro-Man doesn't have any more hit points. He falls over just as easily. But he has a much wider attack pattern. He can hit me from outside of my normal attack range. And he, of course, tries to stay out of my normal attack range, although he's slow enough that that only works if I am not paying attention as I'm approaching him. The goblins and the Ro-Man on their own are not terribly difficult. If I'm fighting just Ro-Man or just goblins, I can fall into their pattern and defeat them specifically. But if there's a goblin and a Ro-Man, then if I fight the goblin, fight to the goblin's pace, I have to worry about the Ro-Man coming in and screwing it up, and if I fight to the Ro-Man's pace, I've got to worry about the goblin coming in and screwing it up. So, that is what makes these games tactically interesting. It's not just the number of enemies on the screen, but how their movement and attack patterns interact. I call that the tactical footprint of an enemy. So the goblin has one tactical footprint, and the Ro-Man has another. In most beat-em-ups, good and bad, you'll find variations on the same kind of enemy. Not just recolored versions, not just palette swaps, but wholly different looking enemies that happen to have the same tactical footprint. I think that's generally a bad idea. You can get a lot of length out of these games by having different tactical footprints and combining them in different ways. That's why a good level in a beat-em-up will feel interesting even if it's the same 4 enemy types over and over. It's because they come with different combinations. They combine in different ways and in different ratios. And oftentimes the level will itself contain... look at that bug, I'm floating. Oftentimes the level itself will contain the ability to fall down pits and so on, and that limits your pattern further. Those can be considered in their own way. They have their own tactical footprint, and they can be considered an enemy, although you can't beat them. This is unique as far as I can tell. This is unique among most games. There are a few games where the enemy's tactical pattern matters in the same way, but normally, something like a shmup, they can be combined in ways where more of them become more dangerous. In this game, the number of enemies is actually much less important to the level of danger than the different combinations of enemies. If I'm fighting 3 different types of enemies, it's going to be with one of each. It's going to be much harder than if I was fighting 3 enemies of 2 different types. The patterns are going to be much more complex and are going to require much more attention in order to prevent me dying. You'll notice that in the previous video I had no problem reaching level die, which is above level 3. In this video I'm having a hard time making it to level 3. That's because having a mixture of enemies means that you have to fight in a much more careful and organized manner, which I'm not really doing very well. And in fact I just died. Now, I think that it's important to know the strengths and weaknesses of the genre you are talking about, of the style of play you're talking about. I think it's important to know how you make the enemies distinct from each other and how you make combinations of enemies interesting to the player. And although I'm saying enemies, in truth it can be anything, puzzles or whatever. If you understand the core play and why it's interesting to the player, you can create challenges that reflect that. You can create challenges that are deep and interesting to the player. And I think that's probably step 1 if you're going to think about making a game. The simple flavoring of the same enemy over and over is never going to cut it. It's going to make you a boring game. And this is a problem I've seen over and over in indie games. They have the same kinds of enemies or the same kinds of challenges over and over, and they don't vary. They look like they vary, but they don't. And so the indie games will only last maybe an hour and a half before they get boring. This can be avoided if you understand what kind of play you're talking about and what makes the play interesting and challenging. Alright, that's my rant for the day done.